was a funny little fella with feet just like I showed ya. Well, he had a girl, her name was Mary Lou. Well, he had a girl, her name was Mary Lou.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor. And if you're like me and you read the newspaper, life can be hard and possibly depressing. I'm here in a holodeck, and this is the holodeck of bad news. These are excerpts and screenshots of a newspaper I read daily. Deaths after attack, early death, heat waves in the ocean. This is naturally in German because it's a German paper. Schweinesystem in der Krise, Pig System in Crises, Verseuchtes Land, Death Trap Atlantic, Biden's plan is not working. It's tough out there. Where do we get the resilience for these living through these days of bad news? I'll tell you where I get them from. I get them from Utopia. So today we're going to talk about Utopia, and I don't know. There's a wonderful person right here with me. You want to follow me to Utopia? Let's go. Let's go through this door, which will hopefully lead to Utopia. And here we are. And I'm not sure if this is Utopia, but I know that we invited a guest that we had here before, and her name is Kristen Ghodsee. And Kristen wrote a book with the title Everyday Utopia. Hello, Kristen. How are you?
Hello, hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Um, can you define the term utopia? And related question, why are people uh, deemed naive when they talk about utopia?
Sure, that's a great question. So first of all, let me say thank you for having me back, both the second time being in the book club, but also from after yesterday. I'm really pleased to be here and finally get a chance to chat about this. So utopia is an interesting word in the sense that it has a sort of double meaning. So Thomas More coined the word for his 1516 book, Utopia, and he was playing on an ambiguity in the ancient Greek, which whereby utopia with a U means no place, a nowhere. But utopia with an EU, which would sound the same, would be utopia means a good place, a good somewhere. And so the idea of utopia, I think, is that it's always a place on the horizon. It's not a place that we can ever quite get to, but it's a place that we're striving to get to. And as we walk towards utopia, we make a lot of gains. We manage to move forward, to progress through history in a particular way.
Hmm.
And the reason I think that people are considered naive is simply that believing in utopia, believing in utopian projects, imagining a utopian horizon is ultimately about hope. It's about believing that there will be a future and about believing that we have a part to play in making that future better. And in our current zeitgeist, we live in a world with a lot of dystopian narratives and, quite frankly, a lot of dystopian things going on. So I think it's very hard for people to find hope. And that's why people who are considered quote unquote utopian or ideas that are associated with utopianism are often considered naive.
I hope you can help us a little bit later. I don't know, to get more, like a better term, resilient. I mean, I was starting the program going through this, little holodeck with all these rotating articles that I read every day, and I think it's really important to walk and chew gum at the same time, to know what's going on and be cognizant of the issues of the so-called real world, but at the same time be able uh, to dream. So maybe you'll help us a little bit with how we do that. But you mentioned the term hope,
Hmm.
and in preparing for this show, Shaila Monkey and I were talking about hope, And this is an excerpt from the book. You write, hope differs from optimism because the latter is just a belief that everything will work out well, whereas hope is an active thought process that affirms our ability to influence the future course of our lives or societies. A chess strategy for life, having multiple counter moves already planned for each of your opponent's potential moves. Now, I was under the impression, or I associated the term hope always with kind of a cop out of like, yeah, let's hope, meaning something very not concrete, wishy-washy. Maybe it's also because politicians use it a lot when there's awful school shootings and say, hope and prayers and whatnot. But
Hmm.
tell me a little bit about um, your definition of hope here, because hope for you has all this agency, and I really never thought about it that way.
Right. So it's really, I think, very important for people to understand that there's a difference between hope as an emotion, which is, I think, what you are talking about, and hope as a cognitive capacity. So hope as an emotion is precisely this kind of, positive thinking. It's the opposite of fear and anxiety. And it's this sort of optimism. This is why I say I think that a lot of people conflate hope and optimism because they're emotional states. But I'm not interested in hope that is the opposite of fear and anxiety. I'm much more interested in hope that is the opposite of memory. So, memory is a cognitive capacity to access the past with your mind. So, if you have a good memory,
Hmm.
you remember details, you remember facts, you do well at school, you study for exams, and regurgitate what you need to know in order to pass those exams and do well. We also know that as we get older, our memory doesn't, stay as strong as it was when we were younger, and we have memory training. We actually can do exercises to strengthen our cognitive capacity to remember. So, in the psychological literature, hope is the cognitive capacity to imagine future goals and then to imagine pathways that you can take to those goals and strategies for how to avoid the inevitable obstacles and challenges that you're going to face on the way to those goals. Now, hope as a cognitive capacity is an individual cognitive capacity, but it's also very much a communal cognitive capacity. So
Hmm.
we have individual ways of remembering the past, but we also have collective ways of remembering the past. Public memory is a project, often the state is involved in this to get us to remember certain facts about the past to shape our behavior in the present. But what I argue in the book is that hope is this agentic capacity to influence the future, to believe, either individually or collectively, that we living here today are the ones who make the future that is going to come tomorrow. And just like we can do memory training and strengthen our cognitive capacity to remember, I believe we can also, in fact, it's quite clear in the literature that we can strengthen our cognitive capacities for hope. And that means that when we get better at hoping, we get better at influencing the future, at believing that we can influence the future. And unfortunately, I think today, so many young people, but I think just people broadly, because we're constantly bombarded by so much bad news, we've really allowed our cognitive capacity to hope to atrophy. And one of the projects of this book is to try to help people get it back.
Well, the book is absolutely amazing, and it gave me a lot of hope indeed. Uh, but you destroy one of my favorite books, Kristen. I'm not sure if I can never forgive you. One of my favorite books is Brave New World, and here we see these are copies of three books you actually mentioned, very popular dystopian novels. Brave New World in German. This is a German copy from the 70s, Schöne Neue Welt. This is my wife's copy of George Orwell's 1984. And here's The Giver, which my son read in school in
Hmm.
in America. Talk to me about what's the problem with these books.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say, have you ever read Island by Aldous Huxley? His more utopian, one of his later books, which he was his favorite book that he ever wrote. Because if you
No.
haven't, you have to read Island. Yeah.
Okay.
So major reading recommendation right there. So, okay, so I think that the reason I attack these books in the conclusion of my book is not necessarily because they're bad books. In fact, I love Aldous Huxley's work in general. Um, and and 1984 is a cultural touchstone for so many people. However, it's the way that these books are deployed in the sense that all of our young people, especially in the United States, but this is also true in the UK, are forced to read these books at a very early age. The Giver is really between 11 and 13, and then
Hmm.
between the ages of 14 and 18, people read 1984 and Brave New World. And these are incredibly dystopian books about societies, in all cases, which have tried to reach some kind of greater level of equality or to try to change the future in some way. And it devolves into this terrible dystopian nightmare. And so it's interesting to me, and it's not just these books, Animal Farm, Lord of the Flies. There are other books in this genre of dystopianism. And then if you add contemporary television shows, things like The Handmaid's Tale or Squid Game or Black Mirror, these extremely bleak, dark visions of the future. What they do is they rob us of our cognitive capacity for hope
Hmm.
because they teach us in so many ways that if we try to change anything, that it will get worse. So we should just suck up and accept the status quo because if we try to make our future better in any way, if we try to mess with the way things are, the distribution of power and wealth that we have now, we'll end up in some sort of dystopian totalitarian nightmare. And that's what these books teach young children at a very young age. And I think that's a real problem. I think maybe we should teach these books, but we should also teach utopian books as
Hmm.
well, because there are a lot of really wonderful utopian books which show us a better future. And this is one of the reasons why I love Star Trek so much. And I talk about Star
Ah,
Trek in the
that's why
book.
we have a Star Trek lunchbox here
Yes.
on the table, and yeah, we'll address Star Trek, especially Next Generation, and one particular episode that you cite in the book. If you're just tuning in, the guest we have today is Kristen Ghodsee, professor for Russian Eastern European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, writer of many books. She was here before with a book about sex and socialism. Fantastic book. The video is on our playlist. Now, this dystopian, one more question about these dystopian novels. I completely agree with you, with us being so sort of awash with this stuff. There is an allure to it. There is, of course, dramatic power in these narratives. I think that's another reason why writers and producers and directors are going for these narratives versus maybe a utopian narrative, but also talk a little bit about because I feel what they also do, they create in us a kind of like, and I'm guilty as charged in a way like, oh, I told you so kind of feeling. Like, for example, we have family in Hawaii. There's terrible stuff going on in Maui right now. And
Mm.
I gotta tell you, I looked at these terrible images and they are terrible. But then I was like, yeah, this is really like Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, or whatever other book. So we're already sort of primed to uh, not only accept this reality, but also having some sort of like, yeah, I knew that this was coming. It's kind of a weird feeling, like a reward that we're so smart, that we're so we studied these dystopian scenarios that uh, that we get like a little reward that we knew that this was coming, and that is obviously not good.
Right, and what it does is it basically it makes it seem as if this process was inevitable, as if
Yeah.
climate change was inevitable,
And then
as if
cynicism is the only way that
right.
people kind of, and you see this in youth. I don't want to really say that only young people do it. It's really irrespective of the generation, but that kind of cynical, like, oh yeah, of course it's happening. Uh, Absolute inaction follows, like you say.
Exactly. I mean, people get immobilized by the constant stream of just bad news and bad images. I mean, the news, there's this saying, if you work in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads, right? The
That's
whole
what Bixel
idea,
actually just said on the live stream. Yeah,
yes,
correct.
exactly. If you are constantly bombarding people with negative information, then the psychological impact of that is that they're very happy with the small little moments interspersed in all the hell that they have of happiness. And so
Hmm.
they won't challenge the status quo. And
Hmm.
I think that this is intentional. You know, if you give people the cognitive capacity to hope, if you strengthen their cognitive capacity to hope, if you get people together and they realize that they actually have power to change the future, then that challenges the way that the world is organized, particularly these larger political and economic systems. And also just sort of the fundamental ways in which we believe that, like climate change, there's this debate about whether we've passed the quote unquote tipping point, right? And and what does that mean? If we have passed the tipping point, does anything like stopping to drive cars or not eating meat or not flying private planes or all these different things that we can do to actually reduce our carbon emissions and perhaps reduce the warming that's happening? There's this question of like, are we in this moment of deep nihilism? Like, are we just already screwed? Like, is the planet just dying? And certainly, I think the evidence that we get fed constantly by the media is that it is. And so it doesn't really matter what we do. It's out of our control. So we don't have to change anything about the way that we live. We don't have to change anything about the economic and political system that is responsible for this crisis in the first place. So I do think it's very important to understand that this dystopianism, this cynicism, it serves a very concrete purpose in
Hmm.
disciplining us and in getting us to accept the status quo and forget that we do have this capacity, this agentic capacity to shape the future.
Now let's stay with popular culture for a little bit because you're a big Star Trek fan, and you cite
Yes.
the Next Generation episode, The Neutral Zone. Here are a few screenshots from the neutral zone. And interestingly enough, I was looking for screenshots, and this is a podcast, Star Trek fan podcast, and they hated that episode. They said this is so lame, it's so badly written. Oh my God! And so they dissected from sort of a crafts perspective. But tell us about the neutral zone, about that episode, and why is it features so importantly in your book?
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that for contemporary fans of Star Trek looking back, that it may be a kind of clunky episode. But I watched it when it originally aired in 1988. And, 1988 in the United States was this moment of absolute hyper capitalism.
Yep.
It was in the wake of the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas, with his character Gordon Gekko giving this really famous speech about greed is good. And I grew up in a world where people literally had bumper stickers on their cars that said, "He who dies with the most toys wins."
Oh my
So,
God!
no,
Is that for real?
absolutely.
Oh my
That's
God!
for real. That's absolutely for real. You can look it up. I mean, this was a big, and somebody's in the chat saying, yes, they remember that. It's definitely for real. So I grew up in Southern California. So you can imagine like the hyper materialism of being a satellite, a community from Los Angeles. So for Star Trek The Next Generation, to imagine a world 300 years in the future where there was no money, where people don't care about material things,
Mhm.
that was such a shock. Now, I mean, to be fair, I was 18, right? So this was like a really kind of it was a moment that made a really huge impression on me. Because what I love about Star Trek is it embodies this idea of kind of prefigurative politics rather than really discussing how we got to this place where replicators could make everything that we need, and the point of human life is not to accumulate wealth and privilege, but to improve yourself. That whole idea, the idea that it could be 300 years in the future, um, what if it was 50? What if it was 10? How did I know? And and I think the other thing that really made a huge impression on me was that in 1988, I thought that the entire world was probably going to be incinerated in a nuclear war.
Hmm.
And the Cold War, was really at its height with Reagan putting like all these Star Wars things in space and all this stuff. And then in 1989, like, whoops, the Berlin Wall fell. I literally dropped out of college because I thought the world was going to end in a nuclear war. And then not even a year later, the Berlin Wall was gone. And then by 1991, the Soviet Union was gone. That was incomprehensible to somebody in 1988, including, the Soviets themselves, I think. So it just shows you how quickly the world could change. And so this episode is these three Americans, and they're three Americans from 20th century, like 1980s, and they have like the 80s haircuts and everything. They end up, cryogenically frozen, and they get, defrosted basically by the Enterprise. And this one guy, Ralph Offenhouse, I believe is his name, is, you know, definitely this sort of supposed to be like a kind of master of the universe, Wall Street guy who's got all this money and he's got an office and he's got, lots of apartments. And he literally thinks that if they bring him back to Earth, he will have accumulated 300 years worth of interest on his bank accounts. And then he will be this like huge billionaire. And then, of course, he's disabused of that notion by Picard, who basically says, look, your money doesn't matter now. Material things don't matter because, it's you can just replicate anything. If you want stuff, all you have to do is go to the replicator and replicate it. And at the very end of this episode, Offenhouse says, look, what am I, they get dropped off back on Earth. He goes, well, what am I going to do? What's the point of life? And Picard says, the point is to improve yourself, enjoy it. And, Offenhouse is just utterly stunned. So it was a huge cognitive dissonance with the world in 1988 in the United States. And so I think when you watch that episode, you have to remember the cultural context into which it was being broadcast.
Now, oh, I should say that on the table here, let me zoom in here. On the table, there is plenty of ideas for continued reading. Here's Plato the Republic. I mean, you have a long list of selected readings in the back of the book. Here is The City of the Sun by Tommaso Campanella. Let's see here. This is What is to be Done by Chernyshevsky. And this one I actually have on order. The
Red Star by
Red Star.
Bogdanov. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ecotopia. So,
Yes.
I mean, in left circles, I mean, I guess you consider yourself on the left side of the political spectrum. On the left, there people would do people sneer at the idea of ideas when they say, well, you should really analyze this more in material terms. I mean, I don't want to get too much off topic, but I just saw a discussion about degrowth this morning, and there's a fierce fight over degrowth in left circles. One side calling the other side extremely naive and misleading and whatnot. And in this discussion, what came up, the criticism was that um, like what we're talking about today, that a lot of ideas are just extremely naive and they just don't lead anywhere, and we just need to be on the ground organizing. How do you
Yeah.
square
I
that
mean,
circle?
yeah. And, and I did, back in June, I did a podcast called Revolution Z with Michael Albert, who is one of the proponents of Paricon, participatory economics, and sort of moves in anarchist circles. And there was this question of, you know, the importance of being organized and actually being confrontational with the state and actually making demands. And I don't think that these two things are mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
So he was giving a really interesting example of the Vietnam War and the protest against the Vietnam War here in the United States, where he was old enough to have participated in those protests. And while those protests were going on, there were a bunch of, mostly hippies who kind of decided to like check out and make themselves, these little communes in rural areas and just not participate at all in the sort of wider political discussion. And he was very angry at what he saw as their retreat
The
from political
retreat. Yeah.
confrontation. Right. And I thought that was a really interesting point because what he didn't talk about was the draft dodgers. So all of the young men who literally burned their draft cards and ran away to Canada. Now, that was in many ways even more kind of a cowardly thing to do, if you think about it, right? Like rather than just going to go and live in a commune, these
Yep.
guys were just like running away to Canada. But there were so many men who were running away to Canada, and that in and of itself became
Impacts
a
the state.
kind of, yeah, it became a huge sort of veto on the
Hmm.
war. So it worked in concert with the very confrontational protest. And so this is what I think is, I know the left gets really bound up in sectarian conflicts, especially around this concept of degrowth, but other concepts as well. You have a lot of conflicts between labor and environmentalists on certain issues. But I think the key thing is that utopian thinking is not necessarily a replacement for confrontational politics. I think there is a role for organizing and for trying to make change. But I also think, and this is what I really concentrate on in the book, that outside of the public sphere, there are things that we can do in our private lives that will draw from these 2,500 years of utopian experiments that I write about in the book that will make us live more connected and contented lives so that we are more emotionally supported to do the kind of political confrontational work that we need to do or might want to do. Because one of the things on the left that I have seen, and I've been moving in kind of activist circles for like 25 years. I protested the very first Iraq War. So I know from personal experience that one of the biggest problems in progressive politics is burnout.
Hmm.
People get exhausted from, constantly bashing their head against the wall. And one of the biggest problems that I see with progressive politics is that we don't take care of each other. We are not very good at nurturing lateral relationships, nurturing our comrades, to use Jody Dean's term. I think it's really important that these utopian ideas build strong communities, and that strong communities and strong lateral networks of love and care and support are kind of essential for building any kind of future world. And what we need is not more arguments and more scolding about how we should or shouldn't do this, how this or that idea is naive or utopian. What we need is a politics of joy. We need a politics of, getting out there and just living the future that we want to live and finding happiness in, between the wildfires and the floods and all of the awful things that are going on. We still have human lives and we still have human relationships. And those are the people that we see every day in our lives. And we can do things to make those relationships more joyous and more connected. And I think that that is also political. That's what I'm trying to
Absolutely.
say in the book. It's got to
Absolutely.
be
And
political.
and that burnout thing is I think really important. And sometimes that I agree. And those discussions that falls under the table very often, the sheer sort of just the mental energy that is required to keep going, and without nourishing, yeah, that just it goes nowhere, and you don't have the energy to go on the ground and keep going. Now, I want to move to your interest. I mean, the whole book, one thing unites the whole book, and that's why I was joking yesterday when we had technical issues, but we had a little conversation, half hour or so. I asked you if the working title of the book, I don't want to use the F word, but was the working title of the book, God damn, this effing nuclear family sucks. Um,
Yeah.
because what unites all these ideas is really the what I see is what unites it is communal thinking, but also really kind of radical reimagining the core, the nuclear family. And here's a quote, and I hope this is actually from Bodil Gray. Children should have 100 parents, That was the title of her article, I believe.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
So
Yeah.
children should have 100 parents. I can see parents already saying like, "No, oh my God, no, they shouldn't." It's enough that the teachers at school are brainwashing my kids with these weird ideas. So we are in an insane time right now, Kristen, as you know, where the retreat into the family is proposed by the right wingers on a daily basis in any number of repetitive media offerings. The drumbeat is relentless about the family, the family, the family, the nuclear family is going to save us all. And before I want you to respond to this, here's a quote. You quote Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher, a fantastic thinker known for his book Capitalist Realism. And Mark Fisher said, the values that family life depends upon, obligation, trustworthiness, commitment, are precisely those which are held to be obsolete in the new capitalism. Yet, with the public sphere under attack, the family becomes an increasingly important place of respite from the pressures of a world in which instability is a constant. Capitalism requires the family, even as it undermines it. So, in other words, the economic system that we all have to live under is putting enormous stress on families. Yet the drumbeat in our culture is we need to, the family is the most important thing. I mean, it's not a new argument that absent fathers are to blame for the African American community not to be as economically viable as they could be, etc. But talk a little bit about the importance of rethinking uh, what it means, what family means, and what raising a child actually means in that context.
Sure. So, the kind of target of my book is a particular model of the family that is relatively recent in our historical record, and certainly, very recent in terms of the kind of evolutionary biology of humanity. So, the evolutionary anthropology of the family. This is the nuclear family whereby the romantic couple is the container for parenthood, where two people raise their own biological or perhaps adopted children with exclusive biparental care in their single family home, surrounded by hordes of their private stuff. This is the model that most of us who have families are living
That's how
today.
I live. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
My stuff.
Yeah,
Mm,
and the thing is that there are a lot of problems with this model. And so what the book does is I take each piece of this model in each chapter. There's a chapter on housing, there's a chapter on childcare, there's a chapter on education, there's a chapter on property, and then there's a chapter exactly on the history of the nuclear family. Actually, there are two chapters on the history of the nuclear family. And the idea here is simply that, first of all, human beings, from an evolutionary anthropological perspective, are cooperative breeders. That means that if we look at our relatively close primate cousins, exclusive biparental care for children is relatively rare. And so, and we know from history that we have very, very good evidence that we were cooperative breeders before we were biparental breeders. The biparental model comes much later. So, what I am talking about in the book is, first of all, expanding the family. So, as you said, there's a lot of research saying that single parents are not so great for children. And my argument is, well, if two are better than one, then maybe three is better than two, and maybe four is even better than two. I don't know about 100 because how would you exactly work that out? But the idea here is that we should have a greater number of adults, loving, caring, supportive adults in our children's lives. Now, this is not a big stretch when you just look one step out from the way we do things. So, in some families, grandparents are extremely involved in their grandchildren's lives. Aunts and uncles, cousins, people who are sort of close kin are often allo parents to young children. In many religious traditions, there is also the idea of godparents, padrinos or compadres. The idea that like the couple names another couple or two people who are kind of backup parents in case something happens to the biological parents. And, in other cultures, you might have, other wives. In a polygamous culture, there might be co-wives. In a polyandrous culture, in places like the Amazon where they practice partible paternity, you have a mother and you might have two or three fathers. You also have polyandry very high up in the Himalayas, where fraternal polyandry is often the case, where brothers will often marry one wife in order not to divide the land that they inherited from their father. So the human family forms are extremely flexible, creative, and adaptive to environmental and climatic conditions. And so, and then I also can't fail to talk about celibacy or asexuality. So people who
That's
choose
important.
not to,
I really like that because that is
right.
sometimes, I mean, here in, we're in such an over sexualized culture that I had this experience, documenting Second Life now for almost 20 years. I bump into a lot of people who just are completely happy asexual people, and they are really bothered by the perception of SL. I don't want to get off a tangent. This is kind of SL specific, but go ahead. Just wanted to throw that in there. I'm
Yeah,
really
no, I
happy
think
that
it,
you
yeah,
include that.
it's very important to recognize that in all cultures and in all historical epochs, there have been people who chose not to reproduce. And they often live together communally. They're often Cenobitic monastics. The first Cenobitic monastics are from the 5th century BC among the early followers of the Buddha. And then later we see the Cenobitic monastic tradition in Egypt in the Eastern Roman Empire, and then eventually it comes to Europe to Italy. And by 530 AD, we have Saint Benedict of Nursia writing the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is a document which basically outlines how a group of non-related people can live together in harmony with each other and with nature. And the interesting thing about these communities of celibates is that they often raised children because they would take in orphans, they would take in, bastards, otherwise unwanted children. Sometimes nunneries took in, certainly among the Shakers, for instance, they took in women who got
Mm,
pregnant out of wedlock. So, and they raised those children communally. So the key thing is that our mating practices are separable from our parenting practices, from our
mhm,
breeding practices. And this is like the key point that I want to get across to people is that you can still very much be in a pair bonded relationship. And your pair bond, by the way, could be a platonic pair bond. It doesn't have to be a romantic one. But the key thing is that children, we know from the child psychological evidence that children thrive in communities filled with more adults than the two biological parents. And in fact, we now have really good empirical evidence because of children who were stuck at home during the pandemic. They who only had access to their two biological parents, for instance,
mhm,
when we look at babies, these babies are cognitively delayed. They actually need interactions with teachers and preschool, caregivers and neighbors and people at the grocery store and godparents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and all those other adults that are around. So we do ourselves a terrible disservice and we do our children a disservice when we emphasize or insist that parenting must be done within this romantic couple unit. There are other ways of organizing families, and my book is about expanding our ideas about how we could raise our children more collectively. I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't be pair bonded. I think humans are a pair bonding species. I just think that the pair bond is not necessarily the best container for parenthood
mhm.
because parenthood puts an incredible amount of stress on couples and they need help. And that was one thing that we absolutely saw clearly during the pandemic was how quickly people were people desperately sought out others to form pandemic pods to share childcare and homeschooling with others.
There's a whole bunch of really great comments here. Please repost these comments. I'm flying blind today or alone because Shyla is not here and Isabel is not running the stream. Fantastic comments. I just want to say here, Valencia says, I'm an asexual and celibate IRL, but I prefer to live alone and don't want kids, but I think raising kids would be super hard alone. Um, Tab Caddy says, after decades in a child-free by choice marriage, I'm so tired of being excluded from the societal idea of family. That's also an interesting point, is that there's this sort of the stigma if you choose not to have children and then you're in this relationship, then there's also people look at you weird. Um, on the slide projector is a slide for the Shakers. You mentioned the Shakers, and on Wikipedia, they're defined by a millenarian restorationist Christian sect founded in 1747. My question in general, this came up when I read the book. Where is the line between an intentional community, co-housing, co-living, whatever it is, um, and a cult?
Yes,
Where's
I
the
get this.
line?
Right. I get this question a lot, right? And I think that the line here is clearly the lack of a charismatic leader, right? So
Oh,
so
so if I
cults.
started an intentional community, it would be a cult. I understand.
I mean, I definitely think that intentional communities are often characterized as cults, particularly by the parents of children who join intentional communities. Ashrams in India have had similar kinds of critiques, eco villages across Europe. I definitely think that intentional communities can be, um,
Cult
because it's interesting, because
adjacent.
cult adjacent, exactly. But like if a bunch of nuns live together, right? You don't call them a cult, although it is, or a bunch of monks, right? Because it's an established religion if they're Catholics or they're Buddhists or they're Hindus or something like that. Or, in the United States, we really make a great effort to include the Shakers and the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Hutterites and the Bruderhof. There are so many different religious communities that are quite radical. And I mean, in the case
Oh
of the
yeah.
Hutterites
I
and
mean,
yeah,
Scientology is not in Germany. I don't think Scientology. I actually don't know, but Scientology is not deemed a religion here. It's deemed a criminal organization. So
exactly. And that's true in many
ah,
European cultures.
religious freedom.
Right. But I think the key thing here is that cults, are coercive, and the leaders of cults used certain kinds of psychological techniques to kind of entrap people into living in a kind of, particular way, and then also usually often giving of resources or giving certain kinds of privileges to the leader. I think that when we look at the Bruderhof is a great example of a group that I would call Bible communists here in the United States. They exist in Germany as well. They exist in England. They exist in Canada. They exist in Australia. They exist in Korea. They're quite an interesting group. They're pacifists. They're Christian pacifists. The Shakers are kind of an earlier. These were celibates, and they raised children that they took in from others. But obviously, as celibates, it's not always easy to reproduce your way of living, and so as of 2021, I believe that there were only two living Shakers left in the Sabbath Day Lake community in Maine. But the
Mm.
Bruderhof are a group that are still growing strong. And they have a democratically elected, leader. And it's a leadership that rotates through the community, and it's very much, not a cult. Although obviously, because they own all their property in common and they live together in these rural areas, a lot of people want to think of them as a cult, but they're basically just Christian pacifists. So I do agree with you that when you have the presence of a charismatic leader and you have the sort of coercion that often goes with kind of psychological manipulation, things can devolve into cults. But,
Mhm.
and I'm not going to ignore that those things do in fact happen, but that's not always the case. And we certainly don't think of monasteries as being cultish, or beguinages, which I talk about in the book as well. These sort of lay nuns that lived in northern Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands in the Middle Ages. So there are lots of ways in which people have been living communally without being a part of a cult.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Second Life Book Club. Our guest today is Kristen Ghodsee. Her new book is Everyday Utopia: What 2,000 Years of Wild Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life. Absolutely fantastic. So much historical information. We have a whole bunch of biographical slides of some of the major players, certainly not all of them. Just want to throw up one here. Your favorite person, it seems to me, is now where is my slide? Now I can't find it. Um, Alexandra Kollontai or Kollontai. How do I pronounce her name?
Kolontai is fine. Yeah.
Kollontai. Now, why do you love her so much?
Well, because she was a utopian thinker. I think she was an extremely utopian thinker who actually had political power for a brief period of time
Hmm.
in the very early years of the Soviet Union. So 1917, 1918, 1920, 21, and then she sort of leaves in 22. And in this very brief 5 year period, Kollontai actually tried to implement some of the policies that I'm talking about in the Soviet Union. And her work in the Soviet Union later came to inspire many, many kind of what we would call left feminists or material feminists around the world. She's an incredibly influential person, and she really was able to take some of these ideas about reimagining our domestic lives. And, she had this idea of taking the romantic couple and submerging that couple in a sea of lateral relationships. Because I think Kollontai understood something that I think is so important and very few people understand, which is that when we live in a capitalist society, and this is, a lot of what my previous book was about, when we live in a capitalist society, our primary relationships, whether they're romantic or platonic, because I'm fully open to the idea of these platonic pair bonds, because I think they're also very, very important. But when it's particularly salient in romantic heterosexual relationships, that the two partners begin to rely on each other for all of their emotional, intellectual, sexual, psychological needs. And that puts an incredible amount of pressure on that relationship. So you need your romantic partner to be everything to you. And what Kollontai saw was that that was a unique product of capitalism because capitalism isolated us into these silos of the family. And because the outside world was hostile, because the outside world was constantly depleting us, you read that wonderful quote from Mark Fisher about this. We need to retreat into our families, into our relationships to get emotional support and care. And what Kollontai understood was that if we lived in a society where there was not a scarcity of care, which there is in a capitalist society, if we lived in a society where care was more abundant, where we got emotional support from a much wider group of people, then our romantic relationships would be less freighted with all of this baggage that they have right now. And she particularly saw this in the case of childcare. She thought that romance, in many ways, should be independent of childbearing and child rearing, that the state and society should take the responsibility as much as possible for helping parents raise their children so that parents could literally have like date nights, could go on vacation, could actually enjoy each other's company, so that not every single interaction that these two people in this romantic relationship are having is about the kids, which is what often happens.
Hmm.
So I love Kollontai because unlike a lot of the other people that I write about in the book, like Charles Fourier and others who were utopians in the sense that they came up with all these crazy ideas, they didn't actually implement them. And Kollontai implemented them. And she implemented them quite successfully, I think, until, Stalin came along and reversed everything.
You have a great thought in the beginning of the book when you introduce the sharing economy. I mean, we have all these companies that that have business models around sharing bikes or sharing cars, apartments, and whatever. Of course, the big problem is that they are profit-driven companies, where a very small select group of individuals are making shitloads of money, uh, while we have to sort of pay them. But your point in bringing that up is that sort of the idea of not having to own everything is sort of implanted in a new generation, and I see this with my kid. I see it with his friends. This is a very different way of growing up. I mean, they're still obsessed with status symbols, no doubt, but they find it absurd to own a car, for example,
Right.
because you have these services. So I guess your thesis here in the book is that once this again, this is sort of utopian thinking. The idea is sort of slowly creeping into our consciousness, and now all that we got to do is to, of course, get rid of the capitalist mode of production.
I mean, look, it's definitely the case that younger people, understand, for instance, that you don't have to go out. I mean, when like, okay, no, okay, let me just have that sort of like back in my day moment. But like when I was a young person, I saved up all my money to buy records, you know,
Hmm.
LPs, vinyl. And that was a big expense. And, then eventually cassettes and then CDs. I mean, we literally bought the same record sometimes on all three. And now everything is just streaming. Now, that's not great for the artists, but I do
Absolutely, but
think,
and again, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want
yeah.
to make this very clear because I'm looking here at the chat over there, and Valencia says I drive Uber, but they take advantage of their drivers. So all these companies, I mean, we got to make it very clear. I'm certainly not proposing, not saying, well, this is awesome, Airbnb and Uber. I'm not a fan of any of these companies, let alone Spotify or streaming services that exploit the the workers, the artists or the drivers. I mean, it's abysmal what's going on here. Um, but what you're saying in the book is that this is just the idea of sharing as being satisfied with sharing. This is sort of the idea. You're not you're not proposing that this is the end all be all to live in a world where a company like Uber has profits up the wazoo for three people and exploiting tens of thousands or
No, of
hundreds of
course
thousands.
not. Yeah, of course not. No, but what I am saying, I mean, and first of all, like something like Spotify was, the commercialization of Napster, which Napster was
Hmm.
fully communism for music, right? Again, I'm old enough to remember Napster, and I remember downloading, all sorts of files from Napster before they cut it out. When I think about the quote unquote sharing economy is what they call it, I agree it's utterly exploitative. Airbnb, Uber, all of these companies are I mean, and then there are things like Rent the Runway, right? Where in the United States you can literally, rent designer clothes for a weekend or purses. There are purse sites. But what I think is really interesting, and these are all for-profit corporations, but what they're doing subtly and importantly for the younger generation is teaching them that they don't need to own things, that everything is available for rent.
Hmm.
And I think that that's really interesting because it shows us that if we could get rid of these corporations, if we could organize, I don't know if it still exists, but there used to be a thing called couch surfing and blah blah car.
Hmm.
There were all these sort of more sharing kind of community organized ways
Oh,
that
we had
people
a
were sharing.
Mitfahrzentrale in Germany where you put out like a board and they say, hey, I got I'm going from Munich to Berlin tomorrow and I have two spots. And then you call up the guy, and then there was a little agency that made a little off the top, but it was certainly not, uh, you know, run with an insane profit margin. It was very much community based back in
Yes,
my day. Yeah.
exactly. And I think that that's the kind of thing that, we could move towards personally, because not only does it save people money, Secondly, it creates community, right? Because you in a long road trip with people, if you're couch surfing, you're meeting people. You're not going into these empty flats that are like, Airbnb, these sort of ghost flats that nobody actually lives in anymore. I'm so frustrated. There's all sorts of critiques that I have of Airbnb and what it's doing to like rental property, and destroying the inner parts of major cities. But the key thing here is that, thirdly, it reduces our carbon footprint, because we're just buying less stuff, right?
Mhm.
And I talk a lot about, for instance, in the United States, I don't know if this is true in Germany, but in the United States, our appliances, our refrigerators, our washing machines and dryers, they have a lifespan, our water heaters, of 10 years, which means that they end up in landfill in 10 years. I know this because I just recently had to buy a refrigerator. And the guy who sold it to me said it'll last about 10 years, which is outrageous if you think about that. Every single family home buying a new refrigerator every 10 years. So there's planned obsolescence is a big part of this, but it's also the fact that, look, we could be sharing our appliances if we lived in dwellings that were more collective. I'm not saying that we have to live in like one big commune, but there are certainly ways in which we could really build community and reduce our carbon footprints by rethinking our relationship to stuff. And part of rethinking our relationship to stuff is giving up this idea of ownership, which I think that the quote unquote sharing economy is helping the younger generation to do.
Mhm. Here's an excerpt from the book. We've all had bad roommates, the playing of noisy instruments, the cooking of smelly food, or the whining of a local hypochondriac. This is referring to a neighborhood. I think I was that guy. But unless you are wealthy enough to live on a private estate, most of us will have to deal with the people who share our neighborhoods. Imagine the advantage if those we lived near agreed beforehand on a set of protocols to handle any future conflict. I mean, this is really implementable, reasonable stuff as far as I'm concerned. Although, like I said yesterday when I first read it, go like, yeah, how do I deal with the bad room with the roommate from hell? Because I'm really a loner. I need to close my door. But you're not proposing when you're talking about co-housing, co-living. You're not proposing like mandatory like get-togethers in the evening and play like Beatles tunes. And if you don't show up, you're being
No.
excommunicated, right?
No, no, no. I mean, I think that some of the best co-housing and co-living models are precisely those that really create this perfect balance between privacy and community. Because I'm an introvert, I'm a writer, and I need a room of my own. Virginia Woolf said it, and I absolutely think it's true. You need to have a room of your own in order to write.
Hmm.
And preferably, I would say a bathroom as well. Like I think I mentioned this yesterday that there's this thing called the Plan of Saint Gall, which is an 820 AD Carolingian ideal monastery that was built for a bunch of Benedictine monks to live in accord with this rule of Saint Benedict that I
Yeah.
mentioned
Oh,
earlier.
and you can visit it today, no? I
Yes,
didn't.
in Campus Galli in southern Germany, they're actually building, a bunch of experimental archaeologists are building a replica using the tools and materials of the Middle Ages. It is a fantastic site if you ever get down there. I highly recommend it. Kids love it. It's a very cool thing to do. But the one thing about this plan of St. Gall, which you can look up online, is that there are a lot of bathrooms. And it just always makes me laugh that in the ninth century, they understood that the key to living harmoniously with other people was having a lot of bathrooms. I think we live in a world that is like really, filled with a deep and profound scarcity of toilets. And so
Mhm.
the fact that they knew that in the ninth century really makes me laugh. And so I do think that the best arrangements are usually those where you have your own bedroom with a small bathroom
Mhm.
that is attached. And then, and this could be, a larger space if you're living with others, intimates, but that it exists within a larger house, or a larger complex, a larger community of dwellings.
And there are lots of different models for this. So when I visited Two Echo co-housing community in Maine, for instance, they actually had freestanding single-family homes that were very close together, but they were still freestanding. And then they had a really big cooperative house that was in the middle where they had meals together and they had a playroom and a TV room. They had events there, but it was voluntary. Nobody was required to do anything. And then you have like co-living spaces where these are usually for singles, where people have, again, their own room, their own bathroom. Sometimes they have a little kitchen or a little kitchenette. And then a bunch of communal spaces, which like a gym and, a big television room, like a home theater or whatever, a big, huge kitchen with shared appliances and so on and so forth. So there's a way and then of course you have the intentional, you can go all the way to the intentional communities where people, or monasteries, right, where people are really living communally. But even in monasteries, some monasteries, the monks live in what we'd think of as dormitories with beds all in the same room. But in other monasteries, they're given their own private rooms because they're supposed to go there and pray.
Mhm.
So again, I think that the key thing is I'm not saying that we need to give up privacy. I think that would be disastrous. And it certainly would be disastrous for me as a writer. But I do think that the model that we have of these sort of siloed flats or homes where we have all of our appliances, that sit unused for most of the week, for instance, um, privately is really an unsustainable mode of living, but also it destroys our connection to our neighbors and our community. And I think it's really important to think about the ways in which we give up community for the sake of convenience. We often do it without thinking of it.
Absolutely. Um, I don't have any Saint Gall images, but I prepared this image from something called the Familistère. I mean, I don't
Ah,
know how to
yes.
pronounce it, but
Yes,
talk a
in
little bit
in
about
Guise.
that. Yeah.
Yes.
So where is that, and who came up with that, and what is that? Is a an example of co-living,
That's
co-housing.
right.
What is the
Actually, well,
difference
so
between co-living and co-housing, real quick?
yeah, so co-living are usually rental units. So you don't have an ownership stake in the land. Again, many co-living places are run by evil for-profit capitalist corporations. Co-housing, however, is very similar to Baugruppen in Germany. This is a group of people that come together. They often buy land, and then they cut out the middleman of a developer, and they build homes for themselves, and then they occupy those homes. And so co-housing is a much more permanent sort of thing. And the people that you decide to create this co-housing community with are really going to be your long-term community members. The other thing that I would say is the difference between co-living and co-housing, in my experience, is that co-living generally tends to be singles and, younger people, whereas co-housing is intergenerational. So you have older people, you have families, you have singles, you have a very big mix of people that decide to create a community together. Now, often, and this is true in the case of Germany, it's often for environmental reasons. People are trying to reduce their carbon footprints. They're trying to have in Germany what's called Energie Plus homes, which are homes that actually generate energy with solar panels or other kinds of technologies. You also have passive homes. There are a lot of architects that are working on different ways of building homes so that they are either not using very much energy at all or they're actually energy positive. But to come back to the Familistère in Guise, this is in northern France, north of Paris. And this was built by a guy called André Gaudin, who was a follower of Charles Fourier. And it was an ironworks. It's a really incredible, you can actually go and visit this place. It's a museum now. And they call it a utopia realized. And it's based on Fourier's idea of the phalanstery, which was a utopian, basically kind of hotel, a rural hotel where exactly 1,640 people would live. Fourier was very, very precise about how many people would live in a community like this. And there would be a kind of balance between rural and rural agriculture, but also a little bit of industry, cottage industry. There would be an inn for visitors. And the idea was that this is like sort of the ideal way for people to live in harmony with each other in a very kind of It really was. He was called a utopian socialist. He's one of the three big utopian socialist figures in Europe that Marx and Engels later make fun of. Fourier. Godin himself was a political theorist and reformer, but he was also an industrialist.
Mm.
And this community
So
existed
he
for
kept the workers that he wanted to exploit nearby.
He did.
Hmm.
Yes, he did. Yes. But he
Hmm.
gave them housing, and he gave their children education, and he organized all sorts of sort of social events. Now, again, this is the difference between, a cult and a community. Anybody could leave this community at any time. But in fact, as I said earlier, it existed for 108 years. It existed for quite a long time. And many people wanted to join, but there wasn't room for them, and people didn't leave because they were very happy there. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting experiments that we don't hear about. We never get to hear about the things that worked. We only get to hear about the things that didn't work.
But real quick about this thing of like, company towns and where big industrialists and capitalists say like, oh, you know what, you can live here, you have all these amenities. I mean, it's similar maybe to the Google campus nowadays with childcare and everything,
Hmm.
but you're still um, you're not free because you're not running the place. You're there to
Right, but in
bring
the
your
case of
labor power to the machine.
right, but sorry, but in the case of Godin, he gave the entire factory over to the workers. Like it
Mhm.
became a workers' cooperative. So
Mhm.
he actually disenfranchised himself from ownership of this
He
place.
was a class traitor for his
He
own
was a
class.
yes,
No,
he was a class trader. So that's the difference, right? I mean, he owned and operated the place um, because under French law, he had to have like a manager or something like that. But towards the end of his life, as it became legally possible to do so, he incorporated the business and then transferred the shares to the workers.
Mhm.
And so that after Godin's death, rather than, giving this whole enterprise over to his sons and daughters and his family, he gave it to the workers who worked there. So in this case, it really was truly a utopian socialist experiment in the case that the people who worked in this, it was an ironworks, they were ultimately the owners of not only the factory and the business, but also all of the housing.
And you can visit this today. They have a great website. It's really fascinating. If you're in the area, maybe stop by. Now, here is a slide that I want to show. Um, oh, you're looking at
Yep.
the slides.
The adopt a mononym. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, here's like a little checklist of what you could do to, make a better world. If you have kids, let them spend more time with their grandparents, consider different housing arrangements, join a book club. Well, I did that too. Actually founded one. Or some sort of adult education. Adopt a mononym. I've done that. I'm Draxtor. I mean, I still have the Dupre last name to honor my French ancestry in the virtual world. But what is this with this mononyms? This is fascinating to me. What's the history there?
Yeah, so the history here, it comes from 18th century Scottish thinker named William Godwin, who was the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, a very famous feminist who wrote The Vindication of Women's Rights, and he was the father of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Very interesting guy. And he had this theory that surnames perpetuated not only um, private property and capitalism, but also patriarchy. And so his theory was, and he suggests this in his book, it was to just do away with last names because the only reason we have last names is to trace our male ancestors. And if we all had mononyms, then it wouldn't matter who our parents were. We would
Mhm.
just be Draxter or Kristen
Yeah,
or whoever. This is
charismatic
also
leaders of a cult that is not a cult. I get it.
Yeah, that's right, right. Or you could be Bono or Sting. I don't know if they're charismatic leaders of cults, but they're certainly charismatic.
Mhm.
But the other thing that I think is really important here is, and I talk about this in the book, in the United States and Canada, where we had indigenous cultures that were destroyed by European white settler colonialism, one of the first things that they did was make them adopt surnames.
Mhm.
Most Native Americans had mononyms. And it was only recently in Canada that the Canadian government has allowed for the restoration of mononyms. So not all countries, I don't know what the rules are in Germany. I would imagine it would be very hard to have a legal mononym in Germany. But in Canada, you can, if you're a Canadian resident or citizen, you can actually legally change your name to just a mononym. And what that does is that basically says it shows the world that you are you, and not necessarily you in relation to your father or your grandfather or your great grandfather. And I think that's really interesting. Now, in other cases, people adopt their mother's name. Sometimes parents hyphenate their names. But it is still generally the case when we look at the data that most women upon marriage take their husband's name, and that the vast majority of children take their father's name when they're born into heterosexual couples. And so this is a way in which patrilineality and patrilocality instantiates itself in our lives. And so adopting a mononym is just a sort of a funny way, it was sort of a wink to William Godwin of like undermining property relations, because the family is the unit in society that facilitates the intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege. And so if you start to trouble this family unit, the nuclear family, as well as this sort of patrilineal traditions, I think you can clearly, in very small ways, make a statement against the things that you don't want to see perpetuated in our
Absolutely
society.
fascinating. Patrilineality, patrilocality. Actually, we so over prepared. I have slides with these terms and everything. We have about 10 minutes left. This is the
Okay.
Second Life Book Club with Kristen Ghodsee. Her book is Everyday Utopia. Absolutely fascinating and really sort of the kick in the butt for people who feel actually you're talking about bumper stickers earlier. The coolest bumper sticker that I saw maybe 10 years ago was "We're going to hell. Where is my handbasket?" Um, so another person that you profile in the book is Julius Nyerere of
Hmm.
Tanzania. Now I forgot if he was the president of Tanzania at
Yes.
one point.
Yes. Yes, he
And
was.
and so this is so important. About education. Talk a little bit about education here, because his whole thing was, and actually I have this excerpt here. Every school should also be a farm. Rather than treating education as a privilege for academically exceptional individuals, Nyerere imagined schools that cultivated and valued all talents. This is so important. I mean, I'm back in Germany after being in the US for a long time, and I'm appalled by this three-prong education system that we have here, where the
Mm.
kids are sorted after fourth grade. Uh, and I know the argument against it is like, oh yeah, but it's very you can still later you can go to college if you go to night school or whatnot. In reality, that really doesn't happen that often. Basically, this sort of this system is dividing kids at a really criminally early age into manual laborers, if you will, and so the intellectual elite. It's terrible. But anyway, I digress. What was Julius Nyerere's um, concept here?
So the key thing is that there should not be a distinction between manual and mental labor, precisely what you just said. The idea that education is a sorting mechanism rather than an opportunity for children to explore the world and gain knowledge and cultivate their talents. I mean, I think it's really interesting that public education free for all children at public expense was the 10th point of the Communist Manifesto. And education is anything but utopian these days. It is very much a kind of, Pink Floyd sort of brick in the wall
Yeah,
sorting
totally.
mechanism, right? It's kind of dystopian, I think, for a lot of kids. And so Nyerere was the product of a colonial education in Africa, British colonial education, and he really saw the ways in which British colonial education prepared Africans for subjugation within the British Empire. And so when Tanzania became independent and he became president, he wrote, he was a pedagogue. He had done a master's degree in Scotland, and he really understood a lot about educational theory. And he had this vision of a world in which intellectuals and laborers would not be different classes of people, that everybody who worked with their mind would also work with their hands, and vice versa. And this isn't, by the way, this is an idea that goes back to somebody else I write about in the book, Anton Makarenko, who was a Ukrainian educational
Oh
theorist, but
yeah.
also back to Kropotkin, who was a Russian prince who became an anarchist. So there have been a lot of experiments with, and I talk about some of them in the book, where educational institutions try to break down the barrier between mental and manual labor. And I think you're absolutely right. The German system of just sort of tracking kids at such a young age, either into sort of manual careers or intellectual careers, studying for the Abitur or whatever, like it's precisely this model of making a division between those in society who are going to work with their hands and those in society who are going to work with their heads. And I think that Neyere and his educational theory was really important in trying to undermine that division.
This creates also resentment that is really palpable. You see it. I mean, my American wife, she pointed this out in certain situations, different jobs that she had here. Why are people so like, this kind of like mean girl type of situation that she found herself in an office situation. I mean, again, this is not exclusive to Germany. I mean, The Office was a wonderful American spin-off of a British show, but the way she described it to me, this was all held over from situations that were created when the kids were sorted after fourth grade, and these type of resentments followed these adults through their entire life. And
Oh, absolutely. Oh, my daughter went to gymnasium in
right,
Waldkirch,
talk
which
about
is in,
that. She
yeah,
went a year in Germany when she was
yes,
14 or 15.
13.
Hmm.
So yeah, she came to Germany when she was 13, 14. She did a year in gymnasium, and then she did, when she was 14, 15, in a different city, a gymnasium. This was like a very academic, the called Zeiss Gymnasium in Jena. But in her first gymnasium, she was like in seventh
And
grade.
we have to say that the gymnasium is sort of the highest track that leads you to university. That's where sort of the intellectuals hang out. They go to the gymnasium,
Right.
they graduate with the Abitur, and then they go to university. That's the track for people who pay attention in class, who study hard, and are rewarded. The others are
Yes,
digging the ditch and drink
exactly.
and drink beer while they're doing it.
And
So
drinking beer, right. So, I mean, it was kind of a tragedy. So first of all, she was a guest student at this school, and she didn't speak any German. So she literally got thrown into a school when she was 13 without speaking any German, which was pretty horrendous for her. But within 3 months, she was fine. But those first 3 months, she had a really good friend. It was hard for her. She was 13. She didn't know any of the kids. She didn't speak German. And then the other thing is that this is in the Black Forest. So she also didn't speak Badisch, which is the dialect that they speak down there. And so even if she could kind of muddle through in Hochdeutsch, she had some problems with Badisch. But she had this one friend who she got really close to. The friend didn't speak any English, but was very patient with Christiana and spoke to Christiana in German. And then at half term, like after the Christmas holidays, this friend got kicked out of the gymnasium and got sent to the
Realschule is the next one coming.
Realschule. Exactly. So Christiana's only friend, my daughter's only friend, got kicked out to the Realschule. And Christiana, first of all, didn't realize that you could get kicked out of like middle school. She
Mhm.
was really, really, really upset by this. And I was sort of like, oh my God. And it just turns out that this young woman wasn't performing academically up to the standards that the teachers had for her. And they just thought she'd do better in the Realschule. So they booted her out. And I thought, God, that is harsh for a 13-year-old.
Mhm.
I can't even imagine if you're 13 feeling that kind of pressure.
The
But
terms that you just used, I mean, the way they sort of describe it, oh, she would do better in these types of environments. I mean,
yes,
this is adding insult to injury. I mean, the
it
way,
really,
yeah.
yeah, it really is. Absolutely. So yeah, so it definitely critique this model of education. And we have it here in the United States, not to the same degree. We have tracks in the same school. So we have like, what's called sort of like the regular track, and then there's like the AP track or the college track, and different kids get sort of sorted into different tracks. It's not as extreme as in Germany where they're literally in different schools, but they're in different tracks. That tracking, I mean, I understand the thinking behind it, but I think it is very, very damaging because look, sometimes people really like working with their hands. Working with your hands can be fun. Working outside can be fun. And these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Unfortunately, in our society, because of the way capitalism sorts us and because wages and benefits and prestige and status are apportioned based on our career tracks, we hold intellectuals, people who work with their hands with their heads in high esteem. But as somebody in the chat is saying, we absolutely need people that work with their hands. During the pandemic, the essential workers, these were the most important people in our economy. Why are they not paid the most?
Well, but they
This is
got applause. They got applause.
yeah, they
They
got applause,
That's
right?
how they paid for their groceries with
But this is the most
applause.
ridiculous. This is one of the most ridiculous things about capitalism. I just read a story in The Cut about who owns private planes, these horrible things that are destroying the environment. And it turns out that it's a certain class of men who work in real estate, banking, and finance.
Hmm.
And it's like, why do those guys make all that money? They don't do anything. They don't provide anything, right? And the people who are actually like doing the important work that our societies need to survive are getting by on minimum wage or less. As somebody in the chat was talking about how if you drive Uber, you don't even get paid minimum wage, which is outrageous. These are like essential services. So I do think that Nayere's idea of breaking down these barriers between manual and mental labor are really, really important.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. Destigmatize and also, like you said, I mean, the sorting and dividing friends, that's a very specific thing with this German system. But just to value the labor equally. I mean, this is absolutely essential. Now we're out of time.
Okay.
Kristen, absolutely fantastic. Any last words? I mean, it's all in there. The fascinating thing about your book is that it goes back into history, and the ideas are there. They're lying around. They're up for us to grab and implement in a very small way, in a medium way, in a large way. So all these ideas are there, um, and it's just enormously empowering. The book is so. Congratulations,
I'm
really good stuff.
I'm so glad. Yeah, I am so really pleased to be here and to get to share these ideas because I do think that people who are bombarded constantly with dystopian narratives and dystopian images and dystopian popular culture will be really surprised to read this book and see how many utopian experiments have actually worked and how much we could learn from those experiments. I think that's the thing so far when I've done these book events and I've gotten feedback from readers. It's this sort of general incredulity that people have about, oh my God, how was I never taught about all these communities? How was I never taught to think in this positive way? So I really want people to understand that hope is a cognitive capacity. And one of the ways that we flex and strengthen that cognitive capacity for hope is by believing in the possibility of utopia, even if we're never going to get there. Believing in the possibility of hope, of utopia, of the future, that we can make it is the first step in creating a better, more sustainable, more connected, just and equitable future.
Hope, 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 hope. I'm just gonna put out these other um, slides that
Blue
you've read.
sky
Blue
thinking,
sky
yes.
thinking is really cool. Then militant optimism. We didn't talk about Ernst Bloch. Maybe
Yes.
next time.
And
And
Mannheim, Karl Mannheim and Bloch,
yeah,
yes. Very
and
important.
and this is the disease that we're suffering from, and my dad suffers from it too. Is the status quo bias because my dad is a good guy, but when we talk about stuff He always talks about, nah, it's not going to happen because A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Yesterday we talked about, oh, Rutger Bregman is, Vanderveer is mentioning Rutger Bregman. You mentioned
Yes,
Rutger Bregman in this book as well
I
as a
do.
recommended reading. Real quick, why? What is so important about Rutger Bregman?
Well, I think that his book, Utopia for Realists, and his second book, which in English is called Humankind, but I believe it has a different title in German, both of these books are really about challenging the negativity, right? And I'm a big fan of his work. I think he puts a lot of really interesting ideas out there, and he really makes us think, wow, the world could be different than it is if we were willing to make it so. So I'm really, again, I don't think there are enough authors out there that are future positive. There are some, yeah, basic income. Sorry, I'm looking at the comments here. He talks about universal basic income. He talks about the 15-hour work week. He also talks about open borders. He has some really interesting ideas. I'm also a big fan, by the way, of the work of the French economist Thomas Piketty, who
Hmm.
talks about giving every young person at the age of 25 150,000 euro as a state inheritance to deal with global inequality. I think that Piketty's work is super important and inspiring. There's another great book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism by
Hmm.
Aaron Bastani. So there are these future positive books, but what distinguishes their books from my book is that most of these other books are about the public sphere. And my book is really looking at utopian visions for the domestic sphere. And that's where I think we can make an intervention, spending more time with your friends in a non transactional way, spending more time with your family members, your extended family members, caring for your neighbors, for your colleagues, for your comrades, for fellow students, for people in your community. Every single bit of that is political.
Hmm.
People don't think of it as being political, but it is political work as well. Just as much as going to vote, just as much as going to a protest, just as much as going, just to live in a climate camp. Caring for our lateral networks of emotional care, support, and love is a political statement. And we
Yes.
can build the world that we want to see. We can instantiate these prefigurative politics by doing the kind of emotional and comradely labor to build up our communities and strengthen our communities because we're going to need those communities to survive in the 21st century.
Ah, yeah. Kristen, thank you. And you turned me into almost a wardrobe communist. We talked about it briefly yesterday. My
Yes.
20-year-old son wants my Stormtroopers of Death tour sweater from 1999. Here it is. And I said, I'm not going to give it to him. But you are a wardrobe communist with your daughter. And so I will eventually get there and I will entrust him with this amazing, amazing one of a kind hoodie that I bought at an SOD show in 1999. Um, Thank you, Kristen. The book is again Everyday Utopia. This utopian world here was built by Arieto Chiori. Big thanks to Arieto. Wonderful, wonderful job. The sculptures around are made by Sika Ghost, an incredible artist. Here, people in Second Life know her. But and oh yeah, and of course the chairs here, the captain chairs are custom made by Arieto for just this occasion. So big thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I love my captain's chair. I feel very important. I should say, yeah, make it so.
Yeah, make it so. Why is that not on the book cover? Actually, the book is blurred by Thomas Piketty, at least the version that I have. History's Made by the
Yes.
Dreamers, a must read. Thomas Piketty. Oh wow. I'm gonna run through the credits real quick. The Second Life Book Club is now thinned out to monthly. First Wednesday of the month usually. Today is an exception. The show was established on April 8th, 2020. Show is produced by yours truly. Camera and sound by Isabel Sharon. Today by me. I apologize. Avatars are made by Bespoke Caravan. Research by Shyla and Monkey. The location is always second.live/book club. And if you go there, then there's a teleport going to the changing place because we have 4 islands now. The website is drexter.com/SL Book Club. And this is incorrect. This slide. It's not every Wednesday anymore. Like I said, it's every first Wednesday of the month. We have two sponsors. The Black Forest, incidentally, Kristen. Is that a coincidence or what? The Black Forest is a Second Life store run by Arden Schwartzman, and he makes low impact, high detail board games. Amazing board games, chess and so on and so forth. But he also designs his own games that are really, really cool. Very, very cheap and totally playable. Now, a teaser for the next show. This is a special add-on show. Catherine Liu of UC Irvine wrote a book called The Virtue Hoarders a few years ago. It just came out in German with the absolute amazing title Die Tugendpächter. I'll explain what that means next time. But Catherine is coming in August 23rd, so I'll put out notices. That's outside of the usual schedule. But this is it, folks. Thank you very much for coming. I apologize that I didn't pick up the comments, but running the camera and looking at 50 screens here is challenging. We did good, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Well, this is the story of a man who